Hotel on the corner of bitter and sweet. House fires. Chapter 20. The year is 1942. Henry burst through his front door, 15 minutes earlier than the time he normally came home from school. He didn't care, and his parents didn't seem to mind. He needed to talk to someone, needed to tell his parents what was going on. They'd know what to do, wouldn't they? Shouldn't they? Henry needed to do something. But what? What could he do? He was only 12. "Mom, I need to tell you something," he yelled, trying to catch his breath. "Henry, we were hoping you'd be home soon. We have guests for tea." He heard his mother in the kitchen, speaking in Cantonese. She came out, speaking broken English, shushing him, urging him to their modest living room. "Come, you come." Henry found himself indulging in a terrible fantasy. Keiko had run away. She was here, safe. Maybe her entire family had fled, just before the FBI broke down their door, leaving them to find an empty house. The window open, curtains blowing in the wind. He never met them, but could picture them clearly, running down the alley, leaving the FBI agents flat-footed and confused. He walked around to the sitting area and felt his stomach drop, as if hitting the floor, rolling under the couch, lost somewhere. "You must be Henry. We've been waiting for you." An older Caucasian man in a fine tan suit sat across from Henry's father. Sitting next to the man was Chaz. "Sit, sit," Henry's father motioned, speaking Chinglish. "Henry, I'm Charles Preston. I'm a building developer. I think you know Junior here. We call him Chaz. In our house, anyway. You can call him whatever you want." Henry had a few choice names. In 2 languages, even. He waved at Chaz, who smiled so sweetly Henry noticed his dimples for the first time. Still, he didn't understand what was going on. In his own home, no less. What are you doing here?" He thought it, but the words were stuck somewhere in his throat as he realized why his father had worn his suit, the one he always wore to important meetings, that morning. "Your father and I were trying to discuss a business matter, and he indicated you'd be a perfect translator. He says you're learning English over at Rainier Elementary." "Hi, Henry." Chaz winked, then turned to his father. "Henry's one of the smartest kids in class. He can translate anything. Japanese, too, I bet." Those last words came out like mumbled ice cubes as Chaz once again beamed at Henry. Henry could tell Chaz didn't like being there any more than he did, but he was content, playing cat and mouse with Henry while innocently seated at Mr. Preston's elbow. "Henry, Mr. Preston owns several apartment buildings around here. He's interested in developing some property on Maynard Avenue, in Japantown," Henry's father explained in Cantonese. "Since I'm a Chonghua board member, he needs my support, and the support of the Chinese community in the International District. He needs our support for the approval of the City Council." He said it in a way, his tone, his eyes, his mannerisms, that made Henry realize this was a very big deal. Very serious, but also very enthusiastic. His father didn't get excited about too many things. Victories in China over the invading Japanese army, which were few, and Henry's scholarshipping at Rainier were the only things he'd ever talked about with such electric enthusiasm. Until now, anyway. Henry sat on the footstool between them, feeling small and insignificant, caught between a rock and another rock, two towering pieces of adult-shaped granite. "What do I need to do?" he asked in English, then in Cantonese. "Just translate what each of us is saying. The best you can," Mr. Preston said. Henry's father nodded, trying to follow the English words Chaz's father spoke slowly. Henry rubbed grit and soot from the corner of his eyes, wondering about Keiko and her family. He thought about those 3 Japanese couples laying face down on the dirty floor of the Black Elks Club in their evening finery, being hauled out and jailed somewhere. He stared back at Mr. Preston, a man trying to buy land out from under families who were now burning their most precious possessions to keep from being called traitors or spies. For the first time, Henry realized where he was, standing on one side of an unseen line between himself and his father and everything else he'd known. He couldn't recall when he'd crossed it and couldn't see an easy way back. He looked at Mr. Preston and Chaz, then at his father, and nodded. "Go ahead. I'll translate. I'll do my best," he thought. "Henry, can you tell your father that I'm trying to buy the vacant lot behind the Nichibei Publishing Company? If we can force the Japanese newspaper out of business, will he approve of us to buy that land as well?" Henry listened intently. Then he turned to his father, speaking in Cantonese. "He wants to buy the land behind the Japanese newspaper, and the building, too." His father evidently knew this area well, answering, "That property is owned by the Shitame family, but the head of the family was arrested weeks ago. Make an offer to the bank, and they will sell it out from under them." The words came out slowly, presumably so Henry wouldn't miss a thing in translation. Henry was shocked at what he was hearing. He looked around for his mother. She was nowhere to be seen, probably downstairs doing laundry or making tea for the guests. He hesitated for a moment, then looked at Mr. Preston and in all seriousness said, "My father won't approve of the sale. It was once a Japanese cemetery, and it's very bad luck to build there. That's why the lot is empty." Henry pictured a dive bomber, auguring towards its target, loaded with ordnance. Mr. Preston laughed. "He's kidding, right? Ask him if he's joking." Henry could hardly believe that for the first time in months, he was actually talking to his father, and telling him lies. But necessary ones, Henry thought. He looked over at Chaz, who just stared at the ceiling, seemingly out of boredom. Henry's father was hanging on to his every Cantonese word. "Mr. Preston says he wants to turn the building into a jazz club. That kind of music is very popular, and there's a lot of money to be made." Henry pictured his imaginary bomber releasing its payload, the bombs raining down. Screep! His father looked more offended than confused. Bullseye. The bombs exploded on impact. The International District needed many things, his father argued, but more nightclubs and more drunken sailors were evidently not very high on Henry's father's agenda for progressive community development, even if they displaced some of the Japanese in Nihon Machi. The conversation went significantly downhill from there. Mr. Preston grew angry, accusing Henry's father of indulging in Japanese superstition. Henry's father accused Mr. Preston of indulging too often in the spirits that he intended to sell at his proposed jazz club. After some mixed translation on Henry's part, they ended their bilingual discussion, agreeing to disagree, each warily eyeing the other. But they still argued, bypassing Henry altogether, hardly understanding a word each other was saying. Chaz stared at Henry, not even blinking. He opened his coat and showed Henry the button he'd stolen from him. Neither parent noticed, but Henry saw. Chaz flashed him a buck-toothed grin, then closed his coat again and smiled angelically as his father said, "We're done talking about this. I can see coming here was the wrong thing to do. Your people will never be able to handle real business anyway." Henry's mother walked in with a fresh pot of her best chrysanthemum tea, just in time to see Chaz and Mr. Preston stand up and storm out, looking like gamblers who'd lost their last sawbuck on a round of pitch and toss. Henry took a cup of tea and graciously thanked his mother, in English. She didn't understand the words, of course, but seemed to appreciate the tone. After finishing his tea, Henry excused himself to his room. It was early, but he felt weary. He lay down, closing his eyes, and thought about Mr. Preston, the adult version of Chaz, greedily carving up Japantown, and his own father, so eager to help with these important business matters. Henry half expected to feel happy about disrupting their plans, but all he felt was exhausted relief and guilt. He'd never disobeyed his father so blatantly, but he had to. He had seen the fires in Nihonmachi and people burning their prized possessions, ashen remainders of who they had been, who they still were, boarded up storefronts with American flags in the windows. He didn't know much about business, but he knew times were tough and getting worse. He needed to find Keiko. He needed to see her. As darkness fell, he pictured her in some family photograph, a portrait on fire, curling, burning, and turning to ash.